Hey, welcome back, friends and listeners, to the summer series on the show. I know technically summer's over. We're now in autumn. You see, I have not decided yet whether there is going to be a season 2 in the technical sense, meaning that I write original stories, scripted stories, set them to music, and read them to you. What I'm thinking of doing is writing a few more of those stories, combining them with the best of from season 1, and releasing an audiobook version in a few months at some point down the road. But what I will keep doing here on Buddha and the Slut on the show are probably monthly or every 2 weeks I'll do like an impromptu chat time, talk about an issue. In fact, the Anthony Bourdain episode, Hungry for More, that was just off the top of my head, something I was passionate about in the moment. And I think that maybe these off-the-cuff thoughts, stories, ramblings, whatever, will give you a bit more of an insight into how I'm thinking, feeling, and if you're interested, can create more of a two-way discourse, debate, responses, reactions. Maybe I'll get a bit more daring and inflammatory as opposed to just making these personal stories where people nod and go, yes, Brooke, that's very nice. You went somewhere, you did something, and you did it with someone. That's incredible. I was really hoping this podcast would spark some conversation. So, without further ado, that brings us to this month's episode. I don't have a title for it. I was going to originally do one about, about a bungalow I was staying in where there were drugs hidden in the basement and, cops on the take got involved. And this was in Southeast Asia and quite a dangerous, fun story. But actually, I think that one needs proper sound effects and scripting. No, I had to go with my gut. And as I sat in meditation this morning, I woke up, or I came to afterwards, I got conscious. And sometimes I like checking, since I'm on the other side of the world, I'm in the Eastern Hemisphere, I'll see if there was any cool TV the night before back in North America and stream it. The latest episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia was on, and it was called, funnily enough, Time's Up for the Gang. Yep, that's exactly how it sounds. Time's up. Me too. The men from the gang were going to fall, and Dee was going to revel in it. It was actually quite funny and telling and revealing how the gang from the pub had to go to a sexual harassment seminar because Patty's Pub was placed on a list of dangerous places for women. And it was a really good episode. It was very revealing. It showed the worst of all the characters, including the women involved too. But more importantly, it got me to thinking, because as I've been traveling, I've been encountering so many different cultures, and people, of course, respond to the news they see from around the world, and they react to it differently. Obviously, in North America and Western Europe, the last year post-Weinstein allegations have been, tumultuous to say the least, necessary without question. The pendulum has needed to swing for a very long time, and there's a lot of behavior that needs to come out into the light. What has been interesting, though, for me, is that as a pendulum swings, and swings hard and cleaves with a very sharp blade, people have gotten a little bit frustrated or angry with men where they're saying, hey, this being judged in the court of public opinion, having someone, completely lose their job or everything they've built over an unsubstantiated claim, potentially, because we're supposed to believe all women and then, all men are in some way bad or at fault. That's kind of the current zeitgeist. There's been some debate about, whether that's fair or not. I don't think fair enters into it. I think this is the nature of the pendulum swinging. This is what happens when a whole lot of bad is done for a very, very long time between tribes or groups, between people with different hats or different genitals. It doesn't matter, right? Whether it's religious or racial, whether it's sexual orientation, whether it's between genders, it doesn't matter. When there's been an oppressive force and those who are oppressed, when social climate starts to change, when the wind changes, when the pendulum does start to swing back the other way, there's momentum with that. No more inertia. There's momentum for the damn thing to move. It can't stop in the middle. It just can't. It's going to go further the other way before it swings back and eventually, we hope, finds some measure of equilibrium. Yet I say that, and I flash back to a story that I read. Again, I can only speak from a male perspective. That's what I am. But I flash back to a story from, I think it was University of Toronto, and it was this summer. And there was a weekend conference It was a conference about men's frighteningly high suicide rates around the world, on average 6 times what women's are, and in some places between 12 and 20 times more, especially for middle-aged men 30 to 45 or 35 to 55. And this was a conference for men, and spray painted over the entranceway was, on the weekend of the conference, was "Cry babies go home." And to me, that was like a spear in the gut, that you want us to be allies and you want us to be more vulnerable. And yet when we share the thing we are most afraid about, that we can't find a way to feel empowered in this world the way, I'm not talking power, money, and patriarchy. I'm talking about feeling like an actualized spiritual, emotional human being. If we can't fully express ourselves without that being the response as the pendulum is swinging, where the fuck are we going to end up? All right? And now this is going to be an inflammatory comment or statement, but I'm going to make it anyway. I find that what is potentially happening now is akin to what is, or what could be happening soon. With this kind of gender war that feels to be occurring around the world. It's somewhat akin to what is happening in Palestine. Now, I know a whole bunch of you are rolling your eyes now, or saying, F you, Brooker, you don't know what you're talking about, and I'm sorry, but the Jews were oppressed and treated horrifically for a very, very, very long time, culminating in the atrocity, the genocide, the genocidal attempt of World War II of the Nazi regime. And then things change, and now the one oppressed, by all evidence available, by unbiased international observers on the ground, in the air, with connections to all the intelligence agencies around the world, those who were oppressed have now become the oppressors. It is akin to apartheid there, and no one can say anything because the one who was wronged for so long can never be wrong. And that's the thing I'm talking about. That is the shiny yet ugly nub of this discussion. All right? Because I've done some bad things in my past. I don't attribute it to being a man. I attribute it to being a human being who felt powerless at the time. And when people feel powerless, they do shitty stuff. Hence what's happening now in the world between ethnic groups, between genders, between sexualities, between ruling regimes and religions. It doesn't matter. When people feel powerless, they do bad things. And then I have the argument from my female friends and from online, especially when you hear something, when you hear someone like Jordan Peterson talk about, the gender pay gap not being real, or you hear other scholars talking about how there's actually much more equity, and they say that's bullshit. And large groups will clamor and scream at the top of their lungs that things aren't fair. Look at everything that's owned and run and how it's all patriarchy, and tear the patriarchy down. I get the point. Again, part of the pendulum swinging. It has to happen. But here's what's interesting to me. We can talk about stuff owned, we can talk about money, we can talk about our artistic endeavors and the need for expression, our careers. What does it mean to be, quote, a woman or a man, cisgender, this, blah, 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 that, non-gender, non-binary, blah. What does it mean? Identity politics, which is another podcast altogether. But what the crazy fringe, which has become more and more vocal in its distaste for this, what the crazy fringe would like you to believe is that everything that we've built scientifically regarding evolutionary biology is a crock of shit, that there is no inherent difference between men and women, and that the way we have gone and the way we self-organized based upon these biological principles is bull. What's more important are these end expressions of culture and so forth. I wholeheartedly, to my cells, not as a man, as a living creature, disagree with that statement. I'm sorry, and this might be hard, this might be a bitter pill to swallow, but our job is to just make more of ourselves. You might think that script you wrote is important, that painting you made the most beautiful thing, the dance that you devised is the thing that summons God to this plane for a moment as you leap into the air. You might think you're the fastest runner, the strongest ball thrower, weight-lifting, punching person. You might think you're an incredible accountant or an architect who built... You know what? Sorry, but you're all just ants carrying sugar between different anthills. That's all human endeavors really are when it comes down to it, because our programming, our core job as these flesh bags, as these meat suits, is to make more of us. That's what all species are meant to do, and guess what I find even more interesting? And here you go, gals. Here's been something I've known in my gut and in my heart, and many men know deep down and don't want to admit. It's the dirty little secret. And science backs this up. In every two-sex species, females are considered superior. That's right. They're the ones who live longer, that take stressors better, that carry on the species and give birth to others. Okay? You have the power of sexual choice. Mates must scurry for your favor, bash heads and antlers, fight each other, beg and plead, go behind others' backs to try to get a moment with you to carry on their biological imperative, which is to pass on seed. Because in every two-sex species, the XY chromosome, the male, is just kind of a genetic deviation. We're just we're just there to make seed and lift stuff, technically. Whereas you are the ones that define the direction of culture, of where the species goes, of how healthy it is from generation to generation. Now, I know a lot of my female friends will say, you can't define us by our biology. You can't just say that's what we are. We're this walking womb. We're just there to, I want to express more of myself. Well, you're free to express more of yourself. Right now in Western society, you can be whatever you want to be. You can be strong, you can be soft, you can be direct, you can be artistic, you can be athletic, you can be everything. And as that pendulum swings, you're allowed to be more and more a broader spectrum. It's being supported by society. And you might be like, well, what about the gender pay? Well, again, that can be refuted by science. Well, what about the fact that men have made all the rules and made the patriarchy? Well, let me tell you something that I find also fascinating. There are some anthropologists, there are some cultural biologists, there are some evolutionary biologists, there are some scientists who have studied, humanity for quite some time now, who strongly believe that the earliest nomadic tribes were actually matriarchies. That's right. They were run by women. Apparently, there is proof of this in certain basins in Africa, definitely throughout parts of Asia and Southeast Asia, even up in more northern circles and chillier climes. Here's the theory. I'm not saying I know shit. I'm not saying I know the answer, and I'm not saying it's right, but I will say that something in my gut's like, pay attention to this. In the oldest hunter-gatherer societies, if they were matriarchies, the structure is described potentially, theoretically, as being, you had the women running things. You had the mature women of childbearing age running the tribe, managing resources, doing all those great things that women do way better than we do already in the first place. And essentially, men were kind of useless. They'd laze around most of the day. Take a look at lions. Right, the women are doing everything, and they're even hunting too, and they're taking care of the kids, and the men are kind of lazing around in a circle waiting to fight. Right, they're in the sun, rolling on their backs, making sure to sun their junk. Now, in human societies, in these hunter-gatherer sects or groups or tribes, the men were sent out for X many hours or days to go hunt for sustenance and bring it back. Find water, find food, go kill a buffalo, what have you. And the men who were most successful at that, who showed the most talented traits to be able to provide, were the ones that the women chose to mate with, which meant a very, very small percentage of men were given the opportunity to perform their biological imperative, i.e. pass on seed. The rest just kind of sat there and lowered their heads and went, well, my hand's a friend, or this banana tree has a really nice orifice. Apparently that's a thing somewhere in South America or Central America. Now, here's where things apparently or supposedly got interesting. When nomadic tribes started to run into other nomadic tribes, that would lead to, eventually, if there wasn't a treaty, it would lead to conflict over resources. Those resources not just being the available food and water, but also potential, better land or better position on land, and also, to some mindsets and more aggressive tribes, the women and children would be considered resources, potential slave labor or sexual labor. So, with that in mind, at some point, the matriarchs were sending out the men and saying, go fight and defend us. Go kill off these potential threats. And the men, based on loose evidence over several generations, the men would go out and do this, but eventually said, hey, since we're in wartime here and we're fighting for you and we're the ones dying on the front line, we want to make sure you and our kids aren't hurt. Can you kind of pass over the reins of power now and let us make decisions as opposed to having to run everything by you? Which kind of sounds like a classic male-female sitcom in a way, doesn't it? And the women were like, sure, hey, as long as we're not fucked with, absolutely. You quote, run things, little Jimmy, you'll be fine. Knowing inherently, again, that they were superior. And this is when we get to the first pendulum swing. Generations upon generations of men fighting and dying to take a hold of their resources, of their families, their women, their children, their land, and then eventually starting agrarian societies, staying in one place, no longer being nomadic, planting seeds, growing crops, building up towns, using tools, fighting off invaders, building cities, developing technology. Basically, once men figured it out, according to this theory, that there was a way to take the reins of power, not for power's sake at the time, but basically to make women need them, that's where society came from. That is the origin of the patriarchy. Think about it. As men, with our hormonal makeup, with testosterone, and with evolutionary biology, scientifically on page with this, our whole being is designed as a mutation of the XX chromosome, or an XY, as a mutation of that. Our whole being, our whole raison d'etre, our purpose is to pass on our seed. And if we are in a position, or became in a position of power, then we would finally raise the likelihood that even lower ranked men among us, the betas and the gammas and the deltas and what have you, the men who weren't just the cream of the crop and the head buck in the field with the biggest antlers, there was a chance for more of us to pass on our seed, more biological diversity. And I'm not just talking out my ass here. There's, and this one might cause a few smirks too, but famed or infamous gender academic and philosopher Camille Paglia wrote an essay back in the 80s about this, how biological imperative drives much more than we're willing to admit, and that it wasn't just because of the patriarchy writing, quote, history that makes it that men ruled things for so long. In her mind, in the mind of a lot of social theorists, the reason that things have kind of shaped up the way they have in the patriarchy is that men, in a desperate attempt across the board to make themselves viable so they can perform their biological imperative, which is pass on their seed, so women will find them attractive, they focused all of their energy on either achieving great things, math, science, music, art, building, breakthroughs, farming, acquiring talents and power to make themselves viable. Or if they couldn't become viable, if they would never be chosen by a woman, it would also explain why the lion's share of horrific atrocities in human history have been committed by men. Because so many of those men, when their histories were looked at, they all had problems in the realm of socializing and the romantic realm, or with lovers, or with being considered desirable, or they had some sort of deficiency they felt made them not enough and not worthy, and that they had to kill and rape and pillage to prove their worth. It's kind of sad to say, but it's kind of wired into the males of all species to prove worth. And the only reason we have to prove worth, or felt compelled to prove our worth, is because we long for your approval. That is the thesis. I forget which Greek philosopher said it, but it's men worship women and women worship God. The idea that we are wired, and girls, I wish you could understand this, but we are wired where you can like your motorbike, you can like your car, you can like your, you can work out and like your abs, you can like the stuff that you buy, your cool clothes, and hang with your bros. But nothing, absolutely nothing fills you with the breathless, overwhelming, must have, must worship, this will make my life complete feeling, if you're a heterosexual, as a beautiful woman who you perceive as having all of the qualities that you have long desired in a partner. Nothing compares to that feeling of compulsion, of being hypnotized by it, by the sheer gravity of it. It's like you are at once snared by the event horizon of a massive celestial body, and you are pulled in, and there is no escaping it. Whereas that quote, men worshiping women and women worshiping God, came from the fact that, yeah, we're wired to worship you. And you're wired to worship God, i.e. nature. The rules of nature. Pick the best man to carry on the species. Maintain the tribe. Maintain the community. Care for the children. Honor the cycles of nature. Everything from your biology, menstruation, from being seasonal, from understanding the hormone balances, and from your inherent genetic superiority. Again, living longer, living healthier, better left and right brain communication pathways, a thicker cord between the two hemispheres of the brain. You've got it going on. And deep down, we know it. I guess all I'm trying to say after, coming full circle after we started with an episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, God, Christ's sake, is that this is probably going to get worse before it gets better because it feels like we are speaking different languages. To the men out there listening who I consider to be peers, compatriots, even those who are, only listening to this out of a kind of contrarian nature to say, fuck off, Brooke, you don't know what you're talking about. What I can say to you is it's going to be a while before things course correct, and it's going to get harder, and we're going to be asked to be quiet for a longer period of time and listen to women's needs, and it's about time. But don't question your value. You still have things to bring with your inherent maleness. That is, these things are okay. There's goodness in you, in the ability to affect change in the world. Just understand why you're doing it. And if you have frustration or anger at that feeling of powerlessness in this modern life, or because of the madness of the dating game and the false reality of romance, take that frustration and channel it inwards and use it to better yourself, not to blame others. And to my women, to my gals, to my chick posse, let me say, I always knew, from 18 years old onward, I knew that someday you would take over, and I hoped that you would still find me charming and useful enough to sit by the edge of your bed and feed you grapes and tell you nice stories. I still mean it. I've got my CV. I've got my resume ready. But that said, don't forget the thing that makes you so special in the first place. Don't forget kindness. Don't forget compassion. In your rush to anger and to swing your size with the pendulum, I hope you'll understand that we're kind of dumb, and we're still learning, and we're still driven by this deep, dark urge to manifest our worth. And our worth, sadly, hinges as a biological entity squarely on your shoulders. Maybe that is what needs to change, and maybe you, in your battle, can show us how.